In the early morning, on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, a scarlet tunic flew above the tent of Consul Caius Terentius Varro. It was his day to lead the army, and the flag, known as a vexillum, signified battle. Orders would have been distributed the night before by the military tribunes. These captains now assembled the men and cavalry from the larger camp at dawn in preparation to meet up with the forces at the other camp. Velites moved out first, trudging into the water to provide cover for the troops. The consuls left behind 10,000 men to defend the main camp, with orders to assault the Punic camp once the battle had commenced. The remainder of the infantry, around 76,000 men, formed up on the plains. The exact site of battle is unknown. Polybius tells us that it took place on the same side of the river Aphidus as the smaller camp, and that the Roman line faced roughly south. However, the space today between the river and the village of Cannae is too small to hold the armies which took the field. Modern historians Peter O'Connelly and Adrian Goldsworthy have proposed the plausible theory that the river has changed course over 2 millennia and used to be located further to the west. It is this assumption that we will follow. In this case, the Romans would have had room to deploy, with one flank covered by the river and the other anchored by the broken ground around Cannae. This makes sense tactically from the standpoint of the consuls, as the Punic cavalry would have had a harder time maneuvering around the sides. This was indeed a concern in the past, and a reason why the Romans refused to fight on the more open, western side of the river. Given the huge stakes of the coming battle, we shall now look at the tactics of each army. The Roman consuls remained confident in their massive force, and yet were well aware of its drawbacks. They understood the inferiority of their cavalry, and had therefore taken care to position themselves between natural defenses. The cavalry were additionally not given any orders to take the offensive, and instead would be used to guard the Roman flanks. In this case, the cavalry were not expected to carry the day, but merely to delay any assault from the Punic cavalry and let the legionaries do the work. It is with the heavy infantry, then, that the consuls entrusted victory. The battle plan amounts to a strategy of packing the center. This thinking is sensible because such a large body of men is virtually impervious to cavalry strikes. It was also a proven strategy given that at Trebia, 10,000 legionaries had hacked through the Carthaginian center, and at Trasimene, 6,000 concentrated heavy infantry were able to break out of the ambushers' bottleneck. The consuls figured that the same result could be repeated. To make sure of this, they were essentially going to put the full weight of Rome's largest army directly in the center. By forming deeper ranks, the Roman troops would easily be able to keep together and move cohesively. The nearly endless lines of infantry meant that if a man fell, there would be an almost inexhaustible supply of fresh troops to press forward with the attack. Author Robert L. O'Connell likens this to a deadly conveyor belt of shark's teeth. The formation could therefore be counted on to have massive staying power in a frontal assault. Additionally, it had the psychologically reassuring effect of making the vast numbers of green troops feel safe and even confident amongst so many of their brothers in arms. Commentators have equated this human instinct to herd animals grouping together for mutual comfort. It should not be forgotten, though, that this is the behavior of prey in the face of a predator. To Roman eyes, the men deploying in the reinforced triplex Achaeus seemed unstoppable. The consuls must have been pleased that they had amassed such a formidable army and had managed to position it in a way that all but guaranteed Rome's revenge would be swift. Even the great Hannibal could not beat them. Now, it was Hannibal's turn to do just that. He began by sending out the Punic skirmishers to mirror the movements of the enemy. Like their counterparts, they did not seek to engage immediately, and instead fanned out to form a perimeter behind which the rest of the army could deploy. The cavalry most likely crossed the river next to reinforce the screening line, followed then by the infantry. We are not sure whether Hannibal had direct knowledge of the Roman plan, but his past experience was sure to have given him fair warning. He knew that his center had been a weakness previously and would have had to address this. Hannibal's first thought may have been to strengthen it, but would most likely have figured that in the face of overwhelming numbers it would collapse anyways. In his fertile mind, an idea must have emerged that would turn this weakness to his advantage. The general was knowledgeable of Greek military tactics and could have been able to draw on an understanding of the Athenian victory at Marathon, where they were supposed to have withheld the center and crushed the Persian wings. In more recent history, he could have even looked to the naval battle of Icnomus, where the Carthaginian fleet attempted to draw out the dense Roman formation in the center and sweep in from the sides, although on this occasion the strategy had ended in failure because the center collapsed. In any case, the day of battle had come. After weeks spent preparing at Cannae and countless updates from his scouts, Hannibal had made his mind. They came marching across the river, the heavy infantry, veterans of the Punic force now taking their place according to a carefully laid plan. In columns they advanced, the fierce Spanish and Gallic foot soldiers deploying first to form a solid front. Next, the crack Libyans positioned themselves at either end of the battlefield, but remained in column formation while the cavalry moved to the wings. The deception of the day began here. It is important to remember that these generals never had a bird's eye view of the battlefield. What may seem like an obvious trap on a map of the battle was far from that when seen from the ground level. The layout of the Punic force was concealed from the Romans by initial screening troops and the mixed line of infantry that Hannibal had sent out first. All the consuls would have seen was a continuous line of men. According to some sources, Hannibal may even have counted on the wind to help hide the true nature of his force. Apparently he had remarked in his time waiting at Cannae that a southeasterly wind gusted in the morning and could be counted on to whip up dust and blow it towards the Roman line. While this is not confirmed by all sources, such an observation would have been perfectly in line with the crafty general's calculated approach to warfare. Regardless of the wind, there are sure to have been enormous amounts of dust kicked up by the 125,000 pairs of boots and 15,000 sets of hooves on the battlefield. The deployment of the armies would also have been far from the cut-and-dry order implied by diagrams we see today. On top of the elemental effects already mentioned, there would have been tremendous sources of distraction and disorientation. A cacophony of men and beasts, of horns blaring and drums pounding, of shields banging and swords rattling. Thousands of men psyching themselves up to face death and hurling insults at the enemy. Officers shouting orders and captains barking commands as they dressed the ranks. We cannot fully understand what happened that day without hearing these sounds and realizing that these were people, just as real as you or I, that were the ones at Cannae. Not numbers or figures, but living, breathing participants. It is this humanizing aspect of history that should never be ignored and that I will attempt to bring to life. Put yourself there, in that moment, in the shoes of these men, and imagine the overpowering sensation. As a Roman, you march in formation with your tent mates. Just like in your training the past couple months, everything is wrapped in the familiarities of drills you have been practicing. In front of you is Aquila, who boasted last night that he would personally be the one to slay Hannibal, and to your right is Felix, not so lucky this time. He had been throwing up all night and now spits on the ground. His nervousness has faded though, ever since you joined up with the rest of the army. The butterflies in your own stomach begin to disappear as you give him a nudge and together start banging on your shields. The men behind you are doing the same. In fact, it seems as if the entire legion is. All you can see to the left and right are fellow Romans. Were it not for the tiny line of troops in the distance, this is the same as being on the parade ground. And so the Roman troops advanced. 20,000 skirmishers in the front, 56,000 heavy infantry in the center, and 6,000 cavalry on the flanks. Paulus commanded the Roman horse, and was joined by most of the Roman senators. Varro himself was placed at the head of the Latin cavalry, while the proconsul Servilius Geminus led the infantry. The Carthaginians fielded 8,000 skirmishers, 32,000 heavy infantry, and 10,000 cavalry. Hasdrubal took the Spanish and Gallic cavalry to the riverside, while Hanno or Maharbal rode with the Numidians. Hannibal and his brother Mago, meanwhile, stationed themselves in the center. As with most battles of the day, the opening stages involved an exchange of missiles between skirmishers. The nearly 20,000 velites would have advanced in an enormous swarm, marching forward in loose order, their leaders directing their approach. These young troops were brave and enthusiastic, and therefore impulsive. They outnumbered their counterparts 5 to 2. Some may have started to jog, eager to be the first to draw blood. Facing them, however, were Hannibal's experienced killers, professional mercenaries, all with expertise in the arms of their varying nations. Balearics, Numidians, Libyans, Spaniards, and Gauls. While numerically inferior, they were qualitatively superior. Most would have been specialist javelinmen, with the notable exception of the Balearic slingers. These prized mercenaries were trained to use a sling, which could launch projectiles at up to 120 miles per hour with amazing accuracy. Their range far exceeded that of the velites. What followed can be grossly oversimplified as a battle between 20,000 adolescents and 8,000 men. The young Romans would have advanced under a barrage of shots fired from the Punic side. The closer they got, the more frequently these trained shots would find their targets. We can imagine that sectors under fire from the slingers may have been slowed, but the vast numbers of other troops would have pressed on. The velites had no formal organization and would rush forwards in waves as they built up courage to throw their javelins. The Carthaginians responded in kind. Volleys flew back and forth between the two sides under the watchful eyes of both armies. Such an engagement would have been fluid, and may have seen some important features of the plain contested by both sides. The Punic skirmishers were able to hold back the oncoming tide. In fighting it to a standstill, they may have inflicted relatively heavy losses on the velites, and it is even reported that at some point the consul Paulus was dealt a serious head wound from a slinger. Neither side gained a truly decisive advantage, and both sets of skirmishers fell back to their respective sides. The next phase of the battle involved the cavalry. The Romans had already decided to hold position with their horsemen. This immobility would have been further exacerbated by the injured Paulus. Plutarch maintains that when the consul's bodyguard dismounted to protect him, the rest of the cavalry wing assumed a general order had been given and also dismounted. This is not altogether unsurprising, as the Roman cavalrymen had a tendency to get off their horses and fight on foot, even when engaged in combat. This was due to the fact that Romans were generally better infantrymen. Typical cavalry engagements involved a great deal of wheeling and reforming, and groups of dismounted troops could have formed a wall of infantry behind which their horsemen could rally. The particular timing of this blunder, however, was devastating. 6,500 cavalry under Hasdrubal were already racing towards the 2,400 Romans. They were composed of Spaniards and Gauls who functioned as a shock element. The Spanish horsemen carried 2 light throwing spears, a sword, and a round shield. The Gauls were more heavily armored with chainmail and used a strong thrusting spear. The two groups would have delivered a deadly 1-2 punch where the Spanish javelin volleys softened up the enemy before the combined force smashed into close quarters. The charge that came crashing down on the flat-footed and outnumbered Romans was, in the words of Polybius, truly barbaric. Rather than performing normal wheeling maneuvers, the Punic cavalry drove right through their opponents. The ferocity of the attacks felled many of Rome's equestrians and senators. Those that attempted to retreat found themselves trapped by the river and were swiftly cut down. Others, who made a final stand, were annihilated. It's in this frenzy that Paulus may have been finished off. Rather than give chase to the few Romans who escaped, Hasdrubal reeled in and reformed his men. On the other side of the battlefield, 3,500 Numidians were swarming the allied cavalry. Rougher terrain on this side of the battlefield, however, impeded their advance. The resulting standstill was exactly what the Romans had hoped to achieve. Varro's brief moment of satisfaction, however, would be short-lived when Hasdrubal approached with the victorious heavy horse from behind the Roman lines. The allied cavalry stampeded at the sight and swept up the consul in their desperate retreat. This panicked flight allowed the swift Numidians to pick them apart. The pursuit was devastating. Only 300 escaped, including Varro and his bodyguards. In one fell swoop, the huge Roman army was stripped of its top commanders.